the very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is alchemist, to the whole state of things, a pure violence without object anymore. This is a typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. As always, we are sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's guest, consider tossing us $1 a month at www.patreon.com/MUHH, or, leave us a review on iTunes if you can. Also, a shout out to always already absent Sam, Young, Don Sutherland, and Burnout Luke for the iTunes reviews. I think we asked some of our listeners to say, explain Deleuze to me right now, right? Which is a fun meme. And we appreciate the reviews. But today we are excited to announce that we have joining with us Professor Eugene W. Holland, who is Professor Emeritus of the Department of Comparative Studies at The Ohio State University, whose books include Baudelaire and Schizoanalysis, The Sociopoetics of Modernism, Deleuze and Guattari's Anti-Oedipus, Introduction to Schizoanalysis, and Nomad Citizenship. What is it? It's Free Market Communism and the Slow Motion General Strike.
My bad.
As well as A Reader's Guide to 1,000 Plateaus. I think I got all your books in there, right? Eugene, welcome to the show.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
And a forthcoming book, which we will hear about.
Yes.
That was great, Taylor. Taylor with the Ohio State. That was
with the
yes.
Ohio. I made sure. Right. I made sure that I said the Ohio State. But
that was good.
Eugene, I always like to start with kind of not really a softball question, but this is just a fun question for me, and I think for the audience, and it's something that I'm deeply interested in, which is kind of your origin story. Can you tell us just a little bit about, when you started thinking that, hey, I want to do literature, I want to do philosophy. This is something that grabbed you. And I mean the 3 stages, I guess, because I want to know about your interest in literature, specifically French literature. I want to know about your interest in philosophy. And then specifically, if you can, when Deleuze and Guattari became important for you.
Sure. I started out in college as a psychology major and then an economics major. And I quickly found myself up against the limits of those disciplines. And I said, I'm going to just do what I'm interested in. I'm not going to worry about what I'm going to do after college. This was back in the early 70s. And so the feeling was that I didn't have to devote my undergraduate education to vocational training of any kind. So what I had enjoyed doing was taking philosophy courses and taking literature courses, mostly French literature. As it happens, in elementary school, I started studying French in 3rd grade and really fell in love with the language. So I'm not sure I took any other literature courses in college except for French literature. So I said, okay, I'll double major. And I did mostly philosophy of language and phenomenology when I was doing the philosophy undergraduate degree. And then French literature was a standard thing. But what was maybe distinctive about it was this was the moment when Derrida was first being imported into this country. And it happened at Yale, where I was doing my undergraduate work. And so I actually took a graduate seminar on the grammatology.
Yeah.
And actually, the seminar was on something broader than that. I can't remember what it was, but I foolishly either volunteered or was assigned to do a précis of grammatology for this seminar. So that got me into something which you might consider to be kind of a bridge between literature and philosophy, since it was mostly French departments that were interested in Derrida to begin with. So and I did a thesis, a joint thesis for French and philosophy that I think started with Plato and ended up with Mallarmé or something. I have to go back and look at it, but it was of a scope that when I got to graduate school and Fred Jameson assigned the Anti-Oedipus for one of the seminars, I was fascinated. I mean, he had his own reasons for being interested. He then published an essay on the ways one could turn the Anti-Oedipus into a hermeneutics. Okay. I wasn't ready to do that. I was barely keeping afloat. So we started a graduate student reading group, and we read the Anti-Oedipus systematically, if that's possible, for months on end. And one of the things that I think helped me get through it, in addition to the graduate student reading group, was I was working with Herbert Marcuse in philosophy at the time as well.
Wow.
I had to defend schizoanalysis to the author of Reason and Revolution. So I'm not sure I succeeded, but at least it was a challenge that kept me on my toes and got me into the arguments of the book favoring Marx, frankly. I mean, of course, Marcuse was also very thoroughly familiar with Freud. He actually appreciated what they were doing vis-a-vis Freud. He was much less sure about what they were doing vis-a-vis Marx via Nietzsche. So that was the introduction to the book for me. And I wrote one of my 3 qualifying exam essays on schizoanalysis. And so that was my launching pad. And the dissertation ended up being a very small scale look at Baudelaire as an example of what happens when a society becomes market oriented or market based, let's say.
Okay, so there's a lot to react to there. I didn't know you had studied under and had even talked to Marcuse about Anti-Oedipus. Did you ever hey, they talk about you in this book?
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, the Reich, the Marcuse, yes, that came up, sure. I mean, that was one of my life rafts, trying to negotiate this conversation with him. They speak highly of Marcuse. They're a bit sharper with respect to Reich. So I thought I was on safe ground there.
I mean, that is true. And it's, on the one hand, Reich kind of gives them this inspiration that maybe something's wrong with the concept of ideology that doesn't really fit the problems like they are trying to tackle. And so he puts forward that question that they repeat throughout the book, like a refrain. But then obviously, and you point this out in the introduction to schizoanalysis, the reasons for why, Reich is kind of trying to separate the social from the psychological, which would be which would be irrational and subjectivist, and he's making these divisions that they can't really follow him on. And then let's not even talk about where Reich kind of ends up. I mean, admirably, I like the kind of mad scientist going out and trying to locate the organoids, but and it reminds me a little bit of Guattari, in a certain way, the mad scientist. But they, I could see why they would be a little bit sharper with Reich. And now it also makes sense why you incorporate this notion of surplus repression from Marcuse, because you would have discussed that with him.
Yes, yeah. And I guess I'll just add to my little biography just one note, which is that when I got through my dissertation, it was too unwieldy to become a book, so it became 2 books. So the Baudelaire part was my Baudelaire book, and then the introduction to schizoanalysis was the other half of the dissertation, in effect.
Oh.
But what I found particularly useful in schizoanalysis was its appropriation of linguistics. And so it enabled me to get into Baudelaire's poetry in a way I felt very deep. Because of the tools that I was able to recoding that idea, and then meshed with Helmschlev and Jakobsen, it made me able to look at the poems in a very close way, which I look back at now and say, what was I thinking? I mean, but that was the order of the day back then. One did close readings, and so I paid my dues that way.
I just had a quick, pragmatic question, because Taylor and I have been working through Anti-Oedipus, and we like to do maybe a couple of different series concurrently so things remain fresh. And do you feel like there's too much overlap between Anti-Oedipus and Eros and Civilization in terms of, do you think there's something that would be rich about going back and looking at that book? Because I feel, just for me personally, I think the field of libidinal economics, which I think it's part of, that's what really excites me, is this kind of meshing of political economy and psychoanalysis. I think I just find that endlessly fascinating.
Well, I do think there's a lot in Eros and Civilization. In this last manuscript on Perversions of the Market, I sort of select out what I think are the most currently viable concepts from that. And so, yeah, I think it's still very, very valuable. And it's no accident that they're sharper with Reich than they are with Marcuse in the Anti-Oedipus, because they're extending, I think, from his analyses in many ways.
Right.
But, as you said about not making a sharp distinction, not accepting, Deleuze and Guattari not accepting a sharp distinction in Reich between the rational and the irrational, I think Deleuze and Guattari would pause in the idea that you could distinguish repression from surplus repression.
Mm-hmm.
Not that Marcuse is insisting that there is a sharp line there, but the terminology lends itself to thinking in an older way that there is a certain number of hours that are work and there's a certain number of hours of the day that are surplus work, and that is no longer consonant with their view of the Marxian economics.
This maybe sheds a little bit of light on, and I'm anticipating on something that stood out to me very much was the fact that in your introduction to schizoanalysis, as you said, the second part of your dissertation,
Right.
One of the things that I really appreciated, because I do think it doesn't get looked at enough, sometimes it just goes off the radar, which is the notion of anti-production.
Yeah.
And you spend a lot of time very patiently and connecting it in ways that I hadn't thought of, and making it much clearer than I think even Deleuze and Guattari do, because they don't really define it.
Right.
They mobilize it. But
Right.
this notion of anti-production does seem to be perhaps would it be in dialogue with this notion of surplus repression that you're saying doesn't necessarily work for them?
All that doesn't work for them is the notion that there's a sharp boundary between repression and surplus repression. They certainly would agree that there's a surplus repression.
Gotcha.
And it does link up with anti-production via, and this is not in Marcuse, but via the notion of guilt. And this is something that Deleuze and Guattari get from Nietzsche directly, Genealogy of Morals. I suggest somewhere they get it also via Bataille and
Yes.
the notion of expenditure. That's more controversial. But in any case, what I think Marcuse doesn't see that they do is that debt is a vector for guilt.
Mm-hmm.
And in psychoanalysis, of course, guilt has an entirely different foundation. It's familial, it's interpersonal. I think Marcuse is still working in an Hegelian or an Hegelian Marxist framework where the surplus is generated from below, if you will.
Yes.
So that the work is primary and the surplus is over and above. Well, Deleuze and Guattari have reversed that. They say, in effect, surplus value comes first, surplus repression comes first. And so there is a connection, but it's not one that Marcuse can see because he's more of an Hegelian.
Right. And anti-production shifts. It's not an ahistorical term. This was just part of the problem with psychoanalysis that you are able to come back to, is that, you show anti-production changing from each territorial machine, or from each machine, right? From the primitive territorial machine to the
Right.
despotic machine to the capitalist machine, which eventually anti-production gets fused, throughout production,
Right.
which is how you make very clear that's kind of how the death instinct becomes, subordinate to and infused everywhere.
Infused everywhere. Yes, right.
I really appreciated that refrain in your work, in making clear how anti-production too has this takes on these different forms as we move through the ideal types of societal machines.
Right. Always historicize, as Jameson used to say. And they're very good at it. I mean, part of it is ideal type, as you say, but it still makes for historical contrasts that are very useful. And, since they fused Nietzsche onto Marx in this way, you have David Graeber's magnum opus on debt, and you have Lazzarato's The Indebted Man. I mean, a lot of people have picked up on this and seen the importance of assigning debt a role that is not there in Marx. Not that debt isn't there, but the role that it's playing is not there in Marx.
I see. The psychodynamics, as you might call it, correct?
Yes, but also the notion, and this is what I think Bataille makes very clear, and they do cite Bataille, I think, once in the book, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway,
yes.
That all societies are organized around the expenditure of a surplus, not around the production of anything. And I think that's what I think I say. Maybe I said something like that. If Bataille hadn't existed, they would have had to invent him. Because
you did say that, and I like that. I love that. Go ahead.
Bataille is the one who took Nietzsche's insight, which had been largely overlooked, and made an anthropology out of it, in effect. And then, of course, you have Graeber coming out of that and so forth. So I think
Now you bring up Graeber. I just want just really quickly, because I don't want to have to necessarily dwell on this, but he does have this footnote that's a little bit catty, a little bit dismissive about where he cites in full that kind of, I think of it as a famous, line where it's that Nietzsche's the thinker of, how to put it? It's not Mauss, it's Nietzsche who's the thinker of not debt, but it's
symbolic exchange, or
it's something like this, right? And that Mauss will kind of start with exchange or will hesitate on which is primary, but Nietzsche and Bataille don't hesitate, right? That debt is more primary. And, Graeber's kind of like, well, how could that be? Because I think he's still thinking in terms of financial markets or in terms of the autonomy that they will take on later. I'm not sure that he buys this notion of the mobile blocks of debt in the savage primitive territorial machine, right? And so he dismisses it a little bit too offhand. I'll have to figure out a way to call him out more systematically, because I take issue with that footnote, Mr. Graeber.
Yeah. Well, the trouble is he's an anthropologist and has done a lot of work in this field, and neither Deleuze nor Guattari were anthropologists. And so they're borrowing stuff from the people they know, Mauss in particular. And I think it gets them maybe as far as they need to go, because they're dealing with ideal types after all. But it's probably not going to satisfy someone who's, immersed in the field of anthropology the way Graeber is, or was.
That's true. I remember when I was first reading Debt, I was like, "Hey, we should try to get Graeber on." And Coop's like, "No, I don't think that's going to happen unless you can do a séance." It is.
Well, if you do a séance with Graeber, you got to invite me, because he's amazing. He is amazing.
Did you get to chat with him about some of these things, or just interact with him?
No, I interacted with him very casually one time when I was in London, but never systematically, and never really sat down and compared notes on these things.
Yeah, you could have called him out for that footnote if you really felt like it.
I might have pressed him, yes.
I had a question about your first book on Baudelaire, and you pretty much answered all of it. But the little side note, the corollary to my question was, did it disappoint you that they don't really rely on Baudelaire? They don't really cite him in Capitalism and Schizophrenia. I'm not sure if he shows up in minor literature or What is Philosophy.
No.
I'm not sure if Deleuze ever cites him, but there's a sense in which, they kind of stray from some of those authors that you might see someone like Walter Benjamin or Derrida cite, like Mallarmé and these other kind of more famous French poets. And they always had the flair for the American lit, but that didn't seem to deter you that they never said anything about it, because it's not about who they talked about or not, right? It's about the application of schizoanalysis.
Right. And in fact, in some ways, it gave me an opening, right? They didn't talk about this guy. But the other thing is, I don't think Baudelaire had become too canonical for them, I think, is one way of looking at it. I mean, Artaud, the people they do cite, and they might cite Mallarmé, but Mallarmé is much more esoteric than Baudelaire and far less popular.
Okay.
So I could just write it off to that. He wasn't mad enough.
There you go. I guess that's paradoxical, but if you compare him to Artaud, who obviously Deleuze he'd already shown an interest in, not only in logic of sense, obviously, but in difference of repetition, that, and even given the subtitle of Capitalism and Schizophrenia, it makes sense, right, that Artaud would be given pride of place.
Yeah.
I had a quick question about just going back to anti-production, and I guess I'm thinking about the realization of surplus, like it has to be realized in terms of, I guess, something that Anti-Oedipus, right? They use the example of what the army, right?
Yes.
The army is this way to handle anti-production. So is this, just to spell it out, we kind of danced around it just a little bit, but I think, are we drawing like a one-to-one correlation with the potlatch, just to highlight that a little bit?
Yes, potlatch is the
as a
sort of the
different form of kind of like the historicization that you discussed earlier, right?
Yes.
It's kind of continuing. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, but the thing is that the potlatch, even when it destroys things, is a celebration,
right?
And war is not. So what Bataille will say about this issue is, we're going to expend. Let's expend joyfully,
right,
not lethally. But also they mention not just the military, but they mention advertising as a way of soaking up surplus for no purpose. And I think one of the interesting things that I don't maybe emphasize enough in this more recent manuscript on perversions of the market is that there's the difference between private expenditure and public expenditure. The potlatch is a very public thing, but consumerism has been steered into the private. Well, it starts in the domestic sphere. It's still private, even if it's no longer domestic. And private consumption, which is invidious, to use Veblen's term, is a very different thing from collective anti-production or collective anti-expenditure. The only thing I can think of is July 4th fireworks. I mean, that's a celebration. It's a huge waste, but it's a celebration that people, now, of course, it's a patriotic celebration, so there are some sharp edges to it too. But nonetheless, it's different from private consumerism, and it's different from military expenditure, which is, I think, really the sort of the quintessential anti-production, because you just have to keep building more and more bombs. Right.
And you even use that notion in the production of bombs is this kind of perfect example, because you produce bombs, you blow, you say it like you use the bombs, you blow them up, and it calls for more bombs. But I was also thinking that it also calls to construct what you blow up, right?
Yes, that's right. Yes.
The reason I brought this question up is kind of what it reminded me a little bit of, I guess, on the surplus side is, so you'll often hear pro-capitalist argumentation about, let's say we're gonna take all of Elon, we're gonna appropriate all of Elon Musk's wealth and pay out everyone a share of his wealth. Well, because his wealth it's tied up in the market, right? It's tied up in stock. So this virtual value, they even will acknowledge, oh, well, that's not real value because it hasn't been realized yet.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? And so they even will recognize this disambiguation between value and, I don't know what that would be.
Just to play off and then hand it off.
No, go ahead.
I'm
good.
This reminds me of your discussion. I'm not sure if it's in your recent manuscript, but I know you discuss it in Nomad Citizenship, which is their distinction between the rigid, the supple segmentarity, and then the kind of quanta that can't necessarily be easily quantified. Do you want to kind of maybe speak a little bit to that? Or maybe you can answer Coop originally and I'm muddying the waters.
What was Cooper's question?
Well, I was kind of pointing out what you often hear, and it goes back to surplus, is that, and realization of surplus. So you'll hear, if the refrain will be something like, hey, we should tax Elon Musk. We could, he's worth $1 billion, whatever, 1 billion. We chop that up. We give everybody their share. The pro-capitalist people will recognize, okay, no, just because has these assets, which are primarily tied up in stock, it's not until they realize that the value can be appropriated, or whatever the case may be, right?
Yes.
So they even acknowledge this sort of disambiguation between, you know what I mean? There's kind of a
liquid assets and
right.
The recognition that there is liquidation, there's liquid assets and there's fixed assets, and I don't know how, when Forbes evaluates Elon Musk's wealth, I have no idea whether they look at that or how they match up the two. I think where this does intersect with the comment that Taylor was making is this notion that both beneath and above the market there are quantum flows. Below the market is quantum flows of desire, some of which get captured for consumerism. Above the market there's a quantum flow of wealth, of virtual value, which is denominated by your stock share multiplied by the time, the number of stocks on a given day, but which, if it's liquidated, becomes, it becomes virtual value waiting to be actualized.
Right.
The better example of this, though, is bank balances, because the quantum flow comes out of nowhere, literally out of nowhere. And this is now something that modern monetary theorists have identified as a crucial point to counteract the idea that we have to be stingy because we're borrowing money and we have to pay it back and that stuff. I mean, there's a whole movement now opened up that I think plays on this notion of the quantum flow of wealth or riches or liquid whatever before it even appears on anyone's balance sheets.
Right. the mutant flow, I think is what they call it.
That's right. That's right.
They're quoting Schmidt, I think, when that's at the end of chapter 3, and they talk about this return to Marx is returning to this monetary theory, which is what you're talking about, this kind of, you're owing yourself money on one end of the ledger and creating this kind of just mutant quantum flow of this where capital becomes way more abstract than it is on the other side with wages or even commodities.
I like mutant flow better, actually, than quantum flow.
It makes sense to think of it both ways. And I think that mutant flow isn't even their term. I think they get it from Schmidt, Bernard Schmidt, not the Carl Schmidt that you bring up.
Isn't it Henry Schmidt? Isn't it Henry Schmidt? Or is it Bernard? It doesn't matter. I know the Schmidt you're talking about. They may get it from them. But the reason I like it is because it's not defined. It's totally undefined, totally decoded.
I know that Christian Kerslake has a wonderful essay on it that I've looked at, and it is touching on this very central part. But anyway, you've brought up you said it's called The Perversion of the Market. This is the new work you're working on, right? And I know that Cooper and I were very thrilled with this, and we have some questions about this. I do want to ask, the basic question I had was, you obviously say you're going to look at works, and you do a nice close reading, maybe not as close as you were doing as a grad student, but do the nice close readings of Sade and Masoch, and you propose conceptual terms of sadism, or sadism and masochism. Mm-hmm. Although you won't say sadist and masochist, you'll say Sadian and Masochian, but with capital letters to designate them as these conceptual terms. And I was wondering if you were inspired by the way in which paranoia and schizophrenia get used in the end of Anti-Oedipus to designate these two poles in which the socius or investments can kind of fluctuate. Were you thinking kind of along these kind of lines, and you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yes, they do. I mean, Deleuze and Guattari's reuse of those terms gave me license to retool these other terms. The inspiration came, first of all, there are two sources. One is Deleuze's own book on Masoch. Mm-hmm. And the close reading you've kindly attributed to me is, in fact, his close reading. But he doesn't go where I go with it. Yes. He's being a symptomatologist, not a diagnostician. And
do you want to distinguish between those two before you?
Yes. What he says. I don't mean to
interrupt you, but
no, that's quite all right. What he says in the early pages of the Masoch book is that psychoanalysis and psychology in general has mistaken these two phenomena to be symmetrical counterparts, one of the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's bad symptomatology, because the symptoms, if you look at the literature closely, which is what he does in that book, these are two completely different universes. And I think he even tells the joke about the masochist who goes up to the sadist and says, "Beat me." And the sadist says, "No." Right? Yeah. Because his point is that these things are incompatible.
Right.
And so he's saying we have to look at the symptoms, and if we look at the symptoms as they are displayed in these literary works, we see that each of these is a universe, a syndrome of its own, and they don't match up.
And that's why Freud yoking them together is muddying the waters.
Yes. Krafft-Ebing, Freud, Fromm, almost everyone who does that are making a category mistake. These are two separate things. So he's redrawing the boundaries of the symptoms and saying they're two different syndromes. But he doesn't say what this symptomatology is supposed to diagnose. He says these writers are anthropologists as well as psychologists. He gets that far, but clearly these are diagnostic terms. Mm-hmm. And in fact, he tends to read all of philosophy, and I think arguably literature, as being diagnostic in spirit. What you do is, you're a philosopher, is you diagnose a problem by inventing concepts and so forth. So the symptomatology is there. It's very rich, and it's one of the jumping off places for my using them to diagnose capitalist production and capitalist consumerism. The other source, just tangentially, is a passage from Marcuse where he says, "It may appear that I'm using psychological terms, but in a mass-administered society, psychological terms are sociological terms to start with. It's a much more elegant paragraph than I've been able to recap just now. But this is the other license to do this. And I must say, again, biographically, that I was working with Fred Jameson at the time, as well as Marcuse. And Fred Jameson is never comfortable with psychology, as far as I can tell. He's always he's trying to retool or recode psychology, which is fine. Mm-hmm. But I think he said at one point, I can't remember if this is in print or he said this to me personally, he said, there's much more damning things to be said about capitalism than calling it narcissistic or whatever the case may be.
Right. Okay, I see. Yeah.
So I happily had Marcuse's quote to lean on to get me through this, through the dissertation process.
I like this idea that, because you're right, I mean, Deleuze, he has this trope of thinking in terms of symptomatology. I know he attributes it especially to Nietzsche.
Yes,
and Nietzsche philosophy and Proust. Yeah,
yes.
Just as but what you're saying reminds me a lot of what Guattari says in The Machine of Unconscious when he begins his section on Proust, was just that In Search of Lost Time is a schizoanalytic monograph, and we can kind of use it to understand the unconscious. And so you're saying that sadism and masochism as conceptual entities can help to diagnose certain features that we see in society. It's not just about reading literature better.
Absolutely right. It's connecting that machine, that book machine, with other machines in the social context. That's right. It's not about interpreting literature better. These are diagnostic concepts whose objects are not psychology, not the author.
Right.
But rather capitalist production relations, capitalist consumer relations.
Did you have something to add?
Certainly. So I thought, just looking, I guess for one, I like that you emphasize consumption on this masochistic and the sort of masochistic way.
Right.
Because I think obviously like Baudelaire is good in that he brings up consumption as a big component of the more, I don't know, the postmodern capitalist economy or what have you. But I was thinking about how this actually works is, I don't know if you're familiar with the phrase retail therapy.
Yes.
Where people, it's kind of this like you sort of are deriving this sort of quick and dirty jouissance from this sort of, it's almost like a needless expenditure, like on the individual level, but on the social level, this process is what actually contributes to the expansion of capital. And I'm guessing that is kind of due to whenever the commodity is purchased, that's when the realization of profit takes place.
That's right. That's where it happens.
And like that, it's kind of an imminent thing, correct? Whenever the purchase occurs, or am I?
Yes, that's right. That's absolutely right. That's the moment of realization. And without it, capitalism would have foundered decades or a century and a half ago.
Right.
And you're right. Baudelaire was onto this. I can't remember the name of the Political Economy of Signs. That wasn't it. Anyway,
that's
some of his early work.
Yeah.
Yeah,
the Consumer Society.
Some of his was definitely focused on this because France went through this very rapidly after World War II. It was a very, very, in the United States, it was a matter of, I would say, most of the 20th century. But of course, France was demolished during the First World War, and it took them decades to catch back up. But with the Marshall Plan after World War II, consumerism just went through the roof. And so Baudelaire and others, literary work that I cite from the 60s, called A History of the 60s, was definitely caught up in the same exhilaration, but also befuddlement about what consumerism was about.
And you cite that one story. I don't know if it's a novella or a novel, Les Choses.
Yes, it's a novel.
And I thought that really ties into what Coop is discussing as retail therapy, this little story about these. It's so interesting the way that it ends, right? Where it kind of tells the story about desire and satisfaction and just the kind of imminent failure of this drive to, going from window shopping to actually being able to purchase the things. And then it just kind of fades, it kind of eludes your grasp, right? It
falls flat. Yeah. The term that I use that's akin to retail therapy is one I got from Colin Campbell. It's imaginative hedonism. And he does an extraordinary, the book he wrote is called The Romantic Ethic and the Spirit of Consumerism. So he's playing off of Weber. And he's saying, look at these strains of Protestantism and look how they feed into sentimentalism and then into the pleasure one gains from imagining that you can afford, I don't know, a yacht or some luxurious apartment, which is the way Perec's novel starts. So retail therapy and imaginative hedonism, I think, are very close to one another. The satisfactions of shopping without even going so far as to use the product yet. You haven't gotten to the point of use value. You're not using the product yet. It's just imagining having it or actually buying it. And that's a satisfaction of its own, shopping for it and buying it, which is precisely the moment of realization. And whether you actually enjoy it or not is completely irrelevant to the capitalist.
Right.
Yeah. For me, as someone who has gotten themselves into debt, into credit card debt, as a result of this kind of this, it's really like a masochism in the sense of like, I know that I don't have the money to pay for this now, but I'm still going to do it just to get this sort of feeling, this good feeling, or this, satisfaction from this expenditure that I know is bad, right? There's something that's the kind of masochistic thing that I saw within myself, is like continuing to burrow yourself further in debt to sort of do this. And in so doing, that's obviously what the system sort of wants you to do.
Yeah.
Is keep reproducing or realizing that surplus profit or what have you.
Remember what Bush said about after 9/11, keep shopping, people.
Yeah.
Keep shopping.
People got checks in the mail and it's like, don't put that in the bank, go spend it, right?
Yeah.
I think of the ethics of it too, right? The ethics of capitalism, at least, as ideological level, is, accumulate assets, right? Because don't accumulate debts, accumulate assets.
Mm-hmm.
So it's that enjoyment of that you're receiving through this masochistic practice kind of flies a little bit in the face in a sense, but still gets funneled back into the circuit of production.
Yeah. No, it appears to be just desserts, right? I think I quote a bumper sticker at the end of that manuscript. Living well is the best revenge. And the idea is that you've accepted succumbing to whatever the boss at work, whatever degradation you have to put up with at work. You've agreed to trade in that in order to choose your own commodity and lifestyle. Yeah. So it definitely is both an apparent escape or retribution, and yet, as you say, it's feeding the accumulation of capital. It's realizing capital. I mean,
it's axiomatized it's like an axiomatization, right?
Well, it is definitely. Yes, and absolutely.
It's rendering the debt infinite, right? You gotta put back into that. That.
See, Eugene, you're reading your book has this is. I understand you kind of help fill in so many of these little puzzle pieces with Anti-Oedipus that I've been very excited all week reading the intro to Schizoanalysis and the new piece you sent us, just as a side note. This is all kind of new, so I'm having a lot of fun.
I think, that's good, because I hadn't thought of re-internalizing it and to look at the masochism of someone who knows they can't afford this, but can't resist the temptation of the purchase anyway.
Right.
I'll have to give that some thought, because that's a slightly different constellation of masochism than what I was thinking of, because I was more thinking externally rather than its re-internalization, but that is definitely going on for those of us who are clear that we're in debt over our heads, right?
Right? Yeah. I mean, I've talked to Cooper about this, and it's kind of, we both don't have kids. I have a wife, but my wife and I know Cooper and I have talked about this, where it's like we're not worried about bequeathing an estate. Right?
Yeah.
I just meant to say, I'm not speaking for those who have children and that are thinking of the next generation that they would give an estate to, but just my own thought is, since I don't have to worry about that as much, I think that's part of why not to worry about this taking on of debt. It's also a way of, as Cooper was kind of saying, like, it's kind of like disavowal, right? You know very well.
Yes, that's exactly what it is.
You know very well. So it is. There is something, because I was kind of thinking when I was reading when you were going through Venus and Furs, I was kind of thinking about Freud, the fetish, right? The disavowal of the mother's castration, and then how it all ends with the other male figure coming in and ruining the contract and so now I want revenge. And it does feed into a lot of your other discussions about the kind of tensions between, say, like the fatherland pole and the motherland pole, which I know is not, maybe not as well, you say it in different terms in your newest book, right? This kind of tension between the paternal back in and kind of has to say like, all right, that's enough of your enjoyment. You're not going to, this, you no longer have this access. And that turns into, what's the word? That turns into not separate. Well, you do discuss it sometimes in terms of separation anxiety, right? And then it becomes aggression.
It does become aggression at the end of Venus and Furs, for example.
Yeah.
Definitely. And I think that is sort of points to the kinds of aggressions that then I show in American Psycho.
Yes.
And it's aggressive, and in Rollerball, for that matter. It's aggression in Rollerball. It's aggression in production relations.
Mm-hmm.
In American Psycho, it's even aggression in consumerism because they're competing with everyone else in the Wall Street firm and so forth. So, but I'd have to think more about how it relates to fatherland and motherland.
I know that's more from Nomad Citizenship, but I think it does. I think it still has some of the resonances with your emphasis on psychodynamics, and because you don't merely stop with sadism and masochism as conceptual poles, you do go through these different forms of narcissism.
Yes.
And including these different forms of supremacism that a lot of times you have this kind of motley cocktail, which is very useful for understanding someone like Patrick Bateman from American Psycho.
Right. But now that you mention it, the fatherland, motherland, I think I also talk in that book in Nomad Citizenship about provisioning as part of what the motherland does.
Yes.
And protecting is what the fatherland does. And so if you read that across the end of Venus and Furs, I guess you have the sense that this then has to be read in terms of policy.
Mm-hmm.
Are you going to cut back on welfare? Are you going to, insist that you work to get welfare? I guess that was the Clinton turn.
Right.
I think, and the kind of armoring that Taylor White talks about in terms of the Freikorps soldiers, that I think is a characteristic of the fatherland ethos.
Oh yeah.
Protection, even from the internal enemy, versus provisioning, nurturing, and so forth, which is more of the motherland pole. So I think that connection will work.
Yeah, and the fact that you bring up male fantasies is very important. I know that I've talked to you about it a little bit, but it's a fascinating and a really kind of horrifying 2 volumes. The more you stick with it, a little goes a long way. But anyway, I know you have some other questions that you added.
Yeah.
I don't want to
Taylor,
ask my questions.
Real quick question for you would be: have you ever read the text of American Psycho, just out of curiosity?
The
book, not the film.
No, I have not, but I've talked to my wife about it. She's read it. Okay, she's a big fan of. She was talking about some of the differences between the movie. Yeah.
The novel will go on for pages and pages about what everyone wears. So Patrick Bateman, he goes through and describes, Ralph Lauren suit, Valentino tie, glasses by Oliver People, etc. This is sort of hinted at in the movie, but in the book, it's like you get pages and pages of this crap. It gets very it's very onerous to read through.
I picked that up from Eugene. It sounded like the lists were Homeric in length, right?
Yes.
Just the lists and lists. I kind of got that feel that there was something epic about it.
Yeah. As someone who prefers a sort of minimalist approach in literature, this was just utterly just.
Yes.
I kept kind of flipping forward to the kind of macabre parts to just sort of experience that or whatever. But I wanted to sort of, I guess, ask this question relative to the masochist angle, is because you do bring up the contract between the masochist and, I guess, what would it be? The
dominatrix, whatever you want to call it. Yeah.
Yes, right.
Are you drawing this parallel between kind of the free market, the employment contract as well? Because it is argued as these sort of are on egalitarian footing, and there is a sort of, you're freely entering into this contract. Right. So whatever happens to the outcome disambiguated from this sort of ethics of the process via the contract.
Yeah. Well, that reminds me that there is a thread of my research that didn't get into this manuscript, and I don't know if it's going to get into the book under revision either, but which is the history of contract law across the 19th century. And
fascinating.
The most important thing is that workers now, by the time you get to the end of the 19th century, are getting contracts. That's a relatively new wrinkle. But contract law is changing at the same time. So at the end of the 18th century, contracts were evaluated in a substantial way. In other words, the contract had to be plausibly beneficial to both parties for it to count as a contract, as a legal contract.
Okay.
By the time you get to the end of the 19th century, all that counts is that the parties are sane. With whatever the psychologist decides sane is. So basically, the substantive disadvantage that workers are at in signing contracts has been really effaced or evacuated from the evaluation of contracts by the time you get to the time that Mazoch is writing. So, and then there's the whole, and Marcel Mauss is concerned with this too, the whole difference between a contract society and a patriarchal society. That it's supposed to be things that people who are free enter into willingly, and yet what Mazoch wants to show is that you can enter into a contract and not benefit from it. There's the fact that labor contracts are becoming more prevalent, but also the fact that this is a society, liberal society, which is trying to define itself in terms of contract, including the social contract. I talk more about the social contract in Nomad Citizenship, but it's still part of the same overall picture at different sort of scales of granularity. So the contract, the fact that Mazoch focuses so centrally on the contract in dramatic contrast with de Sade is a standout feature of the contrast for me.
See, one thing that I've been thinking about a lot relative to this, because of the development of the blockchain, right? Because the blockchain is doing something, I feel like it's going to be this more nefarious contract where like it's eliminating the human element entirely. And it's just this machinic bureaucracy of the blockchain will automatically determine what happens. And that will be sort of used as this way to, I guess, you could sort of be, access to resources, access to space, access to whatever food, water, whatever is going to be sort of controlled by this independent machinic process that no third party can really circumvent, which is a terrifying evolution of this same thing, I think, right? It's a furtherance of that whole mechanism. Because you said, like, at one time, there was this, I guess, at least lip service towards both parties benefiting, but now it becomes this sort of basically like a servitude.
It's just to piggyback for a second, Eugene, you mentioned this at the end of Nomad Citizenship, where Deleuze and Guattari, perhaps in a way that is worded, unfortunately, is this notion of machinic enslavement.
Yes.
This is the negative side of these information networks and the sort of the crowd pooling of intelligence. This is perhaps one of the downsides. Anyway,
definitely. And in fact, machinic enslavement was the term that came to mind when Cooper was mentioning the blockchain. I don't know enough about the way blockchain is being used now to enforce contracts to be able to comment. But I think everything will hinge on who writes the contracts and how well they're written. Because once they're in place, it's machinic. I mean, it's pretty much out of people's hands.
And see, this is the problem. The whole ethos behind the blockchain is to provide a network of trust that isn't reliant on a state. So it's not reliant on that. So
absolutely.
Without that, then you have there's no redress. You're just sort of trapped in this indentured servitude. There's no third party state to enter into this disequilibrium on each side of the contract. So it really tips the scales even further in the direction of, I guess, accumulation, or those who have access to accumulation.
Well, you mentioned trust metrics. Everything will hinge on that, because they're trying to substitute trust metrics for the state, which is obviously an enforcement mechanism with very different parameters. And I think there are examples of it working. I don't know how far it will extend into blockchain contracts. I mean, that's yet to be seen. But in Nomad Citizenship, I lean rather heavily on the development of trust metrics. And some of the websites that I was looking at had really elaborate algorithms for establishing trust, 3 or 4 levels deep.
Right.
And whether that's paid off, I don't know, because I'm not in that sphere.
I'm even thinking something as simple as I've been having issues with my Gmail password for the last few days, and it's dumb and it's simple, but trying to get signed into my television in my living room, I have to go through double authentication, and it's just this, I'm trapped in, I've been calling it machinic bureaucracy all week, because I've been trapped in this, like, there's no escape. And it precisely goes into this whole thing about trust. Am I who I say I am? that I'm trying to access this resource, right? So you can begin to see, even as something where the stakes are relatively low,
Right.
that there's a big problem here.
Yes, absolutely. That's, I think we've all been there. I've been there.
I mean, right.
Definitely.
Trying to get into our meeting today, right? Like that's another example of versus if we were in person, right? If we were in person, it would eliminate all the need for this sort of virtual trust networks, etc. Yeah.
I may take responsibility for the trouble getting on today, but I was just fighting with my Washington Post account, not being able to get into that. So I'm right there with you.
Oh, that's hilarious.
I know we've had you for a little while. I did want to at least get to talk more about nomad citizenship, but specifically the subtitle. I mean, I think that for our audience who is at least passingly familiar with Deleuze and Guattari, with or without our nonstop talk about them, do you want to say maybe a little bit? I know that the subtitle itself could be a whole podcast, but I was really struck, and we may not have time enough for free market communism, but I was really struck by slow motion general strike and your way of providing that there's not just two alternatives, say revolution or reform. I was really struck by this kind of saying, there are three options and they're not mutually exclusive. Do you want to say a little bit about that? Because I think that could be very interesting for our listeners.
It was inspired by Walter Benjamin's discussion of the general strike, because he suggests that it's not violent and it's not coercive. And that's, for him, a very important feature of the general strike. So that was one jumping off point. The other jumping off point was provisioning. We talked about the motherland in terms of provisioning. That's one of the things that societies do. In addition to protect, they provision their citizens. And I was obviously looking for a way to restore some provisioning function without involving the state. And so the notion of a slow motion general strike is in some ways paradoxical, because general strikes are usually called to happen all at once. And then the general strike that Benjamin is talking about is that kind of general strike. But what's key to the general strike for him is that one is not seeking for better wages or looking for better working conditions or bargaining power at the table. The general strike is supposed to end capitalism, it's supposed to put an end to it.
Right.
So the slow motion part of the general strike is about finding ways of provisioning oneself or oneselves as groups so as to be able to walk away from institutions that are capitalocentric. So community-supported agriculture is one of the things I mentioned. It's a way of accessing food without going to your capitalist grocery store even, much less the state. So the idea is that, and this was also inspired by Gibson Graham's work on extra capitalist economies. I've forgotten the name of their second book, but The End of Capitalism as We Know It was their first book, and their second book was more about, and here are the things that are already in place that we could jump to without having to worry about whether Kroger will be open or, Vons or whatever, wherever you get your food. So Gibson Graham's work was very important for this idea that in order to support a general strike, or any strike for that matter, you have to have alternative sources of provisioning. And that is where I thought investments should go. It's not reform of existing institutions exactly, because it's actually looking for alternative institutions. But the point was that these alternative institutions already exist. It's a matter of investing in them in all senses of the word and helping them expand, and in the same process starving the capitalist institutions of our trust and our dollars and our investments in all those senses. So that's what the slow motion general strike was trying to accomplish, is trying to sort of cobble together these different themes to propose a way of realizing nomad citizenship. In other words, there wouldn't be one, but a network of institutions, of alternative institutions that you would use for daycare or for provisioning or whatever the case may be. And in each one, you would be a citizen, not a monolithic citizen, but a citizen, a partial citizen.
And I kept seeing a thread running through your works. This is just sort of to wrap up and to get some overarching thoughts, not to close down the discussion, but just to end with something that I saw, this overarching theme, not just of schizoanalysis, which I feel like you've done a lot to keep that notion alive and to give it some application and some breadth, because I do feel like, it's kind of rare to see yet, but also this notion of that I saw clearly in Introduction to Schizoanalysis all the way through, even in your latest book, which hasn't been published, on the Perversions of Markets, which is this notion of this shift from, under the capitalist machine, capital becoming filiative and giving birth to itself, right? To this shift away back towards privileging certain forms of alliances, and what that entails. And you kind of keep that theme going throughout. And I found it very provocative. Is that kind of part of what's involved in this notion of whether Deleuze and Guattari call it a new axiomatic or this new earth, all this different language, this alternatives that you're talking about, is this still involved with, the shift away from capital as filiative back to, well, obviously it's away from capital at all, and it's a different socius, at least ideally, in an ideal type.
Yes.
But alliance is coming back into predominance.
That's right. And another way of talking about it is, well, the term that Deleuze will use often is immanence. That instead of having a transcendent immanence imposing its logic on a field or on a stratum, you have a mode of organization that is immanent to that stratum. And so self-organizing systems is a term I think I use in Nomadic Citizenship. Horizontal as opposed to vertical relations is another set of terms that reflect the same difference. And this is a very common theme, I think. I mean, Deleuze, he calls it transcendental empiricism. But by transcendental, unfortunately, you have to understand the opposite of transcendent. Because the transcendental empiricism is about the network of forces that produce actuality on their own account.
Right.
The rhizome is another one of the terms they use to try to indicate, versus a taproot, that this horizontal patchwork or network of relations. And that you'll find that in the Perversions of the Market book too. I can't remember exactly where now. Well, it's that there's in the 4th chapter where I explain axiomatics.
Yes.
You have an extended market, which is a rhizome. It's the real network of shops, sources of raw materials, workplaces, and so forth, and the modes of transportation that connect them. That's the extended market, which is a rhizome. And then you have the imposition on that of finance capital, which is a vertical or transcendental, semi-transcendent relation. This is where it gets tricky, because it's not the kind of transcendence that characterizes despotism, where you have all expenditure glorifying the god or the king or the emperor. Instead, you have this perverse, I have to underline this, quasi-transcendence where the expenditure is realizing further accumulation. It's all means. It's no ends. So that thread that you've picked out is very much something that I think I got from Deleuze early on. And for me, one of the instances of this that struck me personally most dramatically was the difference between jazz improvisation and playing from a score. Because you can enjoy playing a Chopin nocturne and it's scored for you by a transcendent instance, and that's all well and good, but it's not the same thing as improvising with a group of other people on the spot and coming up with music. And so that's another, for me, that was, and I actually asked Deleuze this, and he said, well, I don't know anything about jazz. That's what he said as an answer. But
it's better than knowing too much, like Adorno, right?
Yes, that's right.
Too much about jazz, and then
or mistake pop music for jazz or something in Adorno's case. But you're right to pick out that theme. I think that when people ask me what I'm interested most in Deleuze, I often start with the notion of immanence and patchworks or networks. Alliances is the term they use in Anti-Oedipus for that. Yeah.
Coop, I wanted to give you the chance if you had one last thing to ask, so we definitely don't want to monopolize your time and be like a bad market. And
I'm enjoying this. I'm enjoying this. Okay. I've retired, so I don't get the chance to do this.
All right. Oh, nice. All right. I have a good one real quick and then you can sort of formulate your own. But Eugene, I was curious. So in the Perversion of the Market text, your approach resonated with me. It reminded me a lot of Baudrillard's discussion of the procession of the simulacra, because he starts out with this notion of the Renaissance, right? And that's where he kind of starts to problematize like the image and show the procession. And so what I was thinking about was, okay, is he sort of picking up on this Kantian means, like the contract for, I forget what you just said. It was like
this all mechanism, means everything
right.
is all means, right? It's the
right,
process kind of gets hijacked, so to speak, right?
Right. So the end, and so it's almost like this, the simulation is just decoupling that, just that sort of process continuing further and further, and even virtualizing as we move into things like blockchain and the internet and so forth. But I was like, I guess that disambiguation between outcome and process maybe being sort of a connective tissue in that critique that Baudrillard's offering. But again, very much reminded me, because you even cite Machiavelli, which would be sort of that almost Renaissance era, roughly, more or less, right?
Yeah. Yes, definitely. This decoupling of, well, it gets reflected later in the evolution of contract law that I described earlier, but the decoupling of formal rationality from substantive rationality has its seat in Machiavelli. I don't think there's any question about that. Now, how that plays out through the simulacrum, I'm not sure, except that what I do insist on is the difference between wealth and surplus value. And that's another decoupling, right? And so the system is now churning out more and more surplus value, especially with things like derivatives and so on, where the total value of derivatives is now several times the output of the entire planet.
Exactly.
Without anyone being able to actually determine what that amount is. I mean, talk about a mutant flow. That's a mutant flow of value, which has become almost completely detached from wealth. Except that certain people who are in the process of manipulating those mutant flows get massively wealthy.
Right.
And so there is that personification of it. But that decoupling of wealth from value, I think, is a really important feature that I find Deleuze and Guattari's vocabulary particularly apt at capturing.
Like I said, the connection in this, the way that he discusses signs being decoupled from signifiers, etc., being a similar, really, and kind of the same sort of process that's occurring, because those two processes are intertwined, right? Then we wind up with this, like you said, the derivative market is a great example. Just to concretize that for the audience, I'm thinking about the movie The Big Short, where they go to talk to the bond rating agency, and they're like, hey, they have their research. They're like, okay, these underlying bonds that are making up these CDOs or whatever are all defaulting. Why the hell is the value of of this derivative still not being impacted by its underlying material, the actual material reality? So that's kind of my, if you can kind of see a little.
Oh yeah, definitely. That's a great moment in that film for an insight into this process.
Yeah, and I guess you just pointed out that it's those people that have access to the levers of that manipulation can really, just like the bond approval agencies, right? Like they're implicit in the whole thing.
Definitely, yeah. So it does come down to people, or at least job functions. So it's not a complete decoupling, but for the most part, for the vast majority of people, it's an absolute decoupling.
Right.
And as I point out a couple times in the book, it's going to destroy the planet.
Yeah.
Yes.
I don't know how to make more of a point of that, but that's that's.
You're not the first one to make the point either, right?
No, that's right. No, in fact, Naomi Klein's book, what is it, World on Fire or something, has passages that I'm putting in the footnotes because she's on this too. I mean, in very dramatic language.
I wanted to ask you about, is there a difference between, for example, the sort of perverse perversity of capitalism and what Deleuze and Guattari say? I think you even cite it in the introduction to schizoanalysis, where it's a passage in chapter 4 where they say more perversion, more artificiality, and pushing deterritorialization until you form a new earth. Is there a difference between is there a good type of perversion that perhaps isn't necessarily always already co-opted by the production of surplus value, or was that a tension that maybe I just misread?
No, I don't think that's something you misread. The accelerationists have taken off from that passage in Anti-Oedipus in ways that I find uncongenial. And when you get to Thousand Plateaus, it's notorious for being far more cautious.
Yes.
And so what they say there, they do say with the quantum flows of desire underneath the market that, and nonetheless sponsored or produced or generated as a byproduct by axiomatization and decoding, there is this affinity that they have for that pole. The schizo, right, is the hero, if you will.
Yes.
But in their caution, they say you can't just in the second volume that you can't just stratify too fast.
Yes.
There's the cancerous black hole. You can wind up in a bad place. And the idea of a new axiomatic is I think grounds for caution. In other words, it's a way of thinking about how to be more cautious about destratification and decoding. So the new axiomatic would not leave the quantum flows alone. It would monetize them, but in a way which would not serve this decoupling of wealth and value. It wouldn't be oriented towards accumulating more surplus value. It would be oriented towards collective enjoyment, the kind of expenditure that the fireworks on 4th of July is a kind of pale echo of. The way I characterize this in the most recent manuscript is you have perversion and you have perversity.
Okay, I see.
Okay, and perversity, this is going back to Marcuse and to Norman O'Brown, the notion of polymorphous perversity, which I think is a feature of the extended multiplicity of the market, what I call the division of labor and the division of leisure, the notion that we are becoming more and more specialized in every aspect of our lives. And this is a kind of perversity. It's not, basic nourishment. It's being a foodie. That's a kind of perversity, right?
Right.
So I distinguish between perversion, which is what capital does to the markets in a bad way, masochism and sadism, and perversity, which is neurodiversity, which is the other term that I throw in there to try to hook onto a movement which has become current in the last, decade, you might say, which I think is a way of maybe taking up the baton from the notion of polymorphous perversity, which still scares a lot of people.
And I think Freud even was meaning to scare some people and to call some people hypocrites when he first kind of articulates that in the 3 essays. And so I guess then, and I'll let Coop take over after this, I suppose then that makes a lot of sense, that differentiating between perversion and perversity. Would you then say that part of what is at least admirable in the primitive territorial machine as they lay it out is that there is this kind of perversity insofar as there's like a collective investment of the organs that, we haven't yet all become privatized in our little nuclear families and Oedipuses. Is this kind of part and parcel with some of your call of maybe
it is.
Yeah, looking back at the primitive territorial machine and seeing some of the things to take from it, because you do.
Absolutely right. The mobile blocks of debt are one. That is to say, this is a horizontal patchwork of debts, not a monolithic one, which was introduced by despotism and then taken over by capital. So that's one feature. The feature that's missing, though, is the division of labor.
Gotcha. Okay.
The extensive division of labor and the division of leisure that I say accompanies it with capitalist consumerism on its positive side, those are only possible when you have a global market or something approaching a global market. And the primitive territorial machine is too small and too non-specialized, so that perversity really is a feature. I want to say this is a feature of markets. And I say that the fact that you're producing not to consume, but to sell your good is already a turning away from a subsistence economy. And that turning away is perversity, etymologically. And it produces taste, right? The human taste for things, which is something categorically different from nutrition, from nourishment, in that one example. And of course, it multiplies all over the place. You get all these specialized consumer niches and lifestyles and so on. And all that perversity is a feature of the market. And that's why I was so struck when I found that passage where they say, or a new axiomatic. And they also say, this is more obvious, the world market is the only thing that's universal in capitalism. They say that in what is philosophy. And they're clearly Well, not clearly, but I think by inference, you can say that they are market socialists, not anti-market socialists. And that's a huge debate in socialist theory and communist theory that I didn't want to get into. And I don't, I mean, I've made up my mind and they can make up their mind, but I think that the market is too important a feature of our society to go back on. And these comments like the market's the only thing that's universal in capitalism, and we might come up with a new axiomatic, are ways of underlining the importance of markets to their thinking about decoding, about schizophrenia as freedom, and so on.
Well, at least popularly too, markets. I mean, I think a lot of people assume capitalism is markets and nothing else, but the market predates. It's an older machine that's been appropriated by capitalism, which is kind of an interesting, I don't know, this is a direction I've been moving into as well as we've been reading Anti-Oedipus, is kind of finding myself going from kind of this more anarchistic sort of approach to like embracing a little bit more of a Marxist, at least historical understanding of the way that society and capital evolve.
Well, I think I have rewritten the preface to the Perversions of the Market book since I sent that version to you two. And in that, I frame this book, the Perversions of the Market book, in relation to my Nomad Citizenship book.
Yeah.
Both of them are insisting on the importance of distinguishing free markets from capitalist markets. And the Nomad Citizenship book is the utopian side of that distinction, and the Perversions of the Market is the critical side of that distinction. But that's definitely what these two books do together, is they try to drive a wedge between markets or free markets and capitalist markets. So that's definitely...
And I was thinking that it reminds me, you have that nice diagram in your book on Deleuze and Guattari's Anti-Oedipus, the Introduction to Schizoanalysis, where you have potentially four machines.
Right.
And you haven't maybe seen the fourth yet, but inherent in the fourth machine, which you call permanent revolution, you still have an economic side on, but we've now gotten rid of the power side, right? And this is kind of decoupling. I say we didn't have time, but I guess we do. This kind of gets elaborating into your notion of free market communism, because it is
absolutely right.
It's taken the best from the different sociuses. If I'm remembering correctly, if the primitive territorial machine didn't have, economy in that market sense, but had power, or had neither.
It had exchange, but not.
It was negative on both sides, right? It didn't have power.
That's right.
Have
That's right.
Economy, but the despotic, you have power, but not the market, so to speak, at least in the sense that you're talking about free markets.
Right.
If capitalism has both, we haven't yet tried taking away the power vector.
Right.
And that seems like something that you think through, you elaborate more upon.
That's right. I hadn't thought of that chart, but you're exactly right to pick out that fourth permutation, which I call permanent revolution, which I then later call, I guess, the slow motion general strike.
Yeah.
That's definitely the kernel that's another version of them. I mean, you can go directly from there to the only thing that's universal in capitalism is the market. I mean, that's the same idea. We got to retain the economic and get rid of the power, which means working in co-ops.
Yep. Which
means, there are different instances of it in different spheres, but that's the getting rid of power. Yeah.
Well, first of all, you should maybe reuse that diagram, because I think it's very suitable, and I assume it's yours. I don't know if you.
Yeah, it is. It's mine.
Yeah. Well, so just reappropriate your own labor there.
I think it may have come up in a seminar with Fred Jameson. He's certainly the one who turned me on to using that gray moss rectangle to map out things. And I can't remember if I introduced it to the seminar or he introduced it to the seminar, but that's definitely one of the kernels, and then it plays out in these different sets of terminology. Yeah,
it helps to kind of see, and I guess my only challenge to you would be coming up with a quippy name for the fourth body without organs. What is the body without organs of permanent revolution? Is it co-ops? Is it the what's the word that Foster comes up with? It's a related difference, right?
Yes, related difference. Yeah.
I wanted you to, maybe you don't have to recap all of her work or whatever, but it did seem like she was a huge, important figure for elaborating nomad citizenship. Do you want to just say a little bit about related difference, since it sounds like a Deleuze concept,
Yes,
right?
you would think so. Yeah. And that's one of the reasons it struck me. I had been invited by the Copenhagen Business School, I think, to give a talk. And so I was reading in management theory and I came across her work and I was really astonished. She has a version or a model of authority which is not transcendent. It's not transcendent authority. It's not a power figure imposing authority. It's what I call in the nomad citizenship power with instead of power over. And that's authority that emerges from within a horizontally organized group. And I give the example of the Orpheus Symphony Orchestra.
Yeah, tell us about this, because I'd never heard
amazing.
of this, and I thought it was incredible.
Again, an institution that exists, right? That is already there, functioning. It's one of the most widely performed groups in the world. They get invited all over the place. They're not recording as much. But anyway, what they do is instead of having the conductor and the musical director and then all the musicians as peons, for each piece they decide to perform, they will select a different conductor and a different musical director from the orchestra, because this flautist happens to know this piece by Bach particularly well, or whatever the case may be. And so there is no permanent authority figure. It's like pirates, right?
Yeah.
Pirates elected their captains. And if the captain wasn't performing right, that captain was gotten rid of. I'm exaggerating for effect. It was trickier than that. But right. in contrast with the Royal Navy, the social relations of pirate ships were much more along the lines of nomad citizenship, and this idea of related difference, that you benefit from difference being put in relation, but not subsumed by an instance of power or authority. And related difference was her term for this. And this is her vision of the way the workplace could be organized, as in contrast with the power pyramid that most corporations are organized by. And so Mondragon cooperatives, there were, again, concrete instances of existing institutions that follow her model, even though the First World War intervened and pretty much blew her whole way of thinking out of the water.
Right. What I liked about the Orpheus Orchestra, because you do mention it extends also to like the CFO and the CEO.
Yes.
It's a kind of rotating type of deal. And as you said, it's kind of self-organizing. It reminded me of, your point about jazz improvisation, but it's now in the kind of self-organizing orchestra, which would seem to be, which kind of scrambles the codes between the typical orchestra versus jazz. And that's why I think I found it so.
He's frozen in Kantian time again.
As you said, this
you were frozen in Kantian time for a moment.
Time is out of joint. I apologize. my main thing being that you could see within the organizational structure of a typically hierarchical type of ensemble, you could see some of that freedom at play even, and that's why I thought it was interesting.
Yeah, and the only exception is they still play scored music. And that's okay.
Right.
I mean, that's the one transcendent instance that has survived this reorganization along more horizontal or power with lines. But power with is a term, I think, Starhawk, who is a new age feminist, I don't know quite what, elaborated on the difference between power with and power over. And it seemed to match this notion of imminent authority as opposed to imposed authority, which I don't really consider authority at all.
Did you have one more? I know you added a couple other questions, Scoop. Did you have one more?
It's a bit unrelated. I don't know if Eugene will indulge us, but I was kind of curious because
I think he will.
our last foray into the 2 or 3 sections of Chapter 3 of Anti-Oedipus. One of the kind of big sticking points, at least for myself, and I know the guests we had on a little bit, was this notion of surplus, and I think in particular surplus flux. So I don't know if that can of worms is too large.
We could probably handle
but
this.
I'm
pretty sure.
If you have an idea, or if you want to maybe elaborate a little bit on that, because I wasn't quite sure if that had any implications for a little bit about what you guys have been discussing relative to the quantum, sort of the desire flowing underneath, the finance on top, and that.
Well, let me make sure I'm understanding the question, because they do talk about the difference between a surplus value of code and a surplus value of flow. Is that where your question lies or not?
Yes, I think so.
Both.
It's the difference between those two. Moving from that type of those types of flows of code and overcode to what the full body of capital entails, right?
So, can you flesh out the question a bit?
I think Cooper was interested in, if codes and overcodes with the surplus value of code and the way that those work in the primitive territorial machine and in the despotic machine they still work within this way in which meaning and belief and customs, traditions, rituals, however you want to say it, are still sort of determining the relative, I don't want to say value, but the relative.
I think you say value.
The relative value of things in a sort of worldview in a society. What is it about the surplus value of flow that Deleuze and Guattari are specifically trying to say with capital and the abstract, the abstraction that implies?
Well, I think that gets to the heart of what makes a society a market society.
Okay.
Because as you say, codes and overcodes, even when they support mercantile capitalism, are based on meaning, custom, all the things you cited. So even mercantile capitalism operates on the basis of an evaluation here based on the customary, thinking about cows or coats or whatever, and its relation to either a different place or a different time. So you have a market, but it's working in the interstices of a coded or overcoded society. When the market becomes the basis of society, then you have surplus value of flow. And what it means is that capital has become the socius, not the earth or the body of the despot. That means that everything is, first of all, quantitative and abstract. Let us say so the social fabric is knit by the cash nexus in terms of money, quantity instead of quality, and quality is derived from.
So that's why the quilting point for the socius is cash. Am I incorrect?
Yes. Okay. No, that's right. I think of quilting point in terms of the way people invest the socius, right?
Gotcha. Okay.
And they're very clear on this. I was just reading in my introduction to schizoanalysis some quotes from them about how money is what enables people to invest the entire social field, even if they're poor.
Interesting.
Even if they're broke. Money still, you could win the lottery by spending $1 and then buy your yacht, right? Money for them is the quilting point, which enables people, even the most disadvantaged, unfortunately, to pursue their, what is it, the Spinoza quote? Pursue their enslavement as if it was their salvation.
Yes, there you go.
Right? Masochism.
We're all temporarily disadvantaged billionaires, right?
Yes, right.
know.
Yeah. So that definitely money is the quilting point. And the other thing that's key about the surplus value of flow is that, and this they get directly from Marx, once capital has subsumed society, in other words, once society becomes a capitalist society, everything is capital. The worker is capital, variable capital. The food that he or she is eating is a commodity that is realizing profit on someone's investment. So capital circulates continually through this system. And the reason they want to insist, I think, on a surplus value flow is that, unlike most orthodox Marxist economics, it precludes the notion that there is value produced somewhere punctually that then ends up in the coffers of the capitalist. What they want to say is that it's a differential, and they use delta, right? It's a differential that arises from the flow. It's not anything that's created in any one place. And they're not the only ones who interpret Marxist economics that way, but it is a kind of interpretation of Marxist analysis of capital. And I think those are the things that the surplus value of flow concept gets them most clearly. The distinction between real capitalism and mercantile capitalism, and the idea that capital now is a differential flow, and that's where surplus arises.
What I appreciated, and I'll let Coop respond just real quickly, that what helped me to reflect, because I was also reflecting on that end of, the capitalist representation and the capitalist machine when I was reading your introduction to schizoanalysis, your quotes from the Grundrisse, where Marx pretty much himself talks about this movement of circulation, and it's only, if anything ever can just be deadlocked, if you only look at a moment of it, then you're not quite seeing the full process, right? The flow that's always, that capital is in the full movement and not any one moment when it's the commodity is just on the shelf or whatever. It's always in this even in these like projections, right? These quarterly projections we can think of, and how that affects investments and share prices, and all of that is all interconnected.
Yeah. Ooh, that's suspect too to the polling kind of thing that Baudelaire goes to, where like the poll itself becomes a sort of launching point for this sort of simulation almost. This
Right,
sort of
like
self-fulfilling prophecy to it, or whatever however you want to describe that.
Yeah. Cooper, did we address your question about surplus value of flow?
Yes. Yes.
Good. Okay.
No, I think I would just point out, maybe for the listeners too, this is kind of how banks sort of sit in this circuit where they sort of operate as, I don't know, what is like the clover leaf for the highway example that was that Dan Smith that?
Well, that's Michel Serre. They quote
that's
Michel Serre.
Right. Okay, that's what it was, right?
And that's an anti-Oedipus, but they're talking about networks and
how capital can always kind of flow in these without sort of hitting.
It can flow. It can
flow through the same physical space, but without ever bumping into itself, I guess.
Right, and I wonder if that has to do with the
banks enable this differential relationship to actually function, or the bank's function is to process that calculation or something. I don't know. I'm just kind of reaching at straws.
Well, the banks initiate it by creating this mutant flow that then gets actualized in factories and so forth. So they're at a crucial position, but they can't exist independently of the entire set of circuits.
Right.
So even though the production and enjoyment of wealth is subordinated to the production and accumulation of surplus value, you can't have the latter without the former. I mean, there still has to be. And
I do like the emphasis that in coding and overcoding, qualities are what are coded, right? These are qualitative flows, but it's with the capitalist body without organs that pure quantities through the abstraction, the general equivalent of money. The quantities are now the abstract flows, and qualities are only kind of epiphenomenal and really lack much consistency beyond perhaps congealing into products to be privately consumed. Now we're back into the domestic masochism.
Right. I think Marx has a great quote about this, where he says that the commodity takes the buyer to market, or something like that.
That's great.
So it's completely flipped, right? It's now the quantities that are driving the qualities.
It's like that picture that's like there's only one footprint in the sand. The commodity carried me to the market, right?
I was thinking Yakov Smirnov, right? In Soviet Russia, commodity by you, right? Something like that. This is all very good and very, very helpful. I suppose one last thing I would say, and this was something that we kind of talked about last week, so it's just something I'm trying to think about too. In your model for, say, a nomad citizenship, is part of the target still, how do I put this nicely? Obviously, with permanent revolution, with the slow motion general strike, there would be this move away from the nuclear family. And would that be just something that kind of happens as a consequence, or should that also be perhaps an axiom, or however you want to say, to be tackled at the same time? Because I was trying to think about this with our last interlocutor, and how is it that transforming capitalist relations or pulling away from them, as you were saying, would that already kind of entail a disinvestment as well from the sort of privatized nuclear family? Because you do treat it in all of your works kind of as this fiction. It's hard to say, it's chicken and the egg thing, right? It's kind of
no, but I was pausing because it's not a fiction; it's the way we live.
Oh, okay.
Right. What Deleuze and Guattari identify is the mistake of psychoanalysis reinforcing it, when in fact society is moving away from it. But it hasn't gotten away from it. I think that,
it's a fiction with real effects, I guess is kind of what I'm saying. We do invest in it.
Yes. And the other thing they point out is that it serves as a perfect relay for capitalists. The nuclear family serves as a perfect relay for capitalist social relations. So capitalism isn't inclined to get away from the nuclear family, although it's definitely subverting it with all the predatory marketing that comes from a mass-mediated society. That aside, the idea is that the move to multiple citizenship,
yes,
which means citizenship in institutions, not just in states, is supposed to, in some ways, soften the boundaries between families and the social fabric.
I like that.
It's not something that I actually addressed head on because it's hard to figure out.
It's a whole nother book. It's a whole
other book, but it's
Yeah.
also just something hard to figure out. I mean, capitalism has reduced us to the bare minimum of reproduction, right?
Yeah.
A couple and a child. And it's one of these feedback loops or resonance chambers where the psychological patterns set up in a nuclear family just prepare people to be capitalist subjects. And so it's hard to figure out how to make inroads into that. So it's something I didn't address. So how did your previous interlocutor address that, if they did?
Obviously, I think that the consensus is obviously that the nuclear family is kind of artificially reinforced in a certain way.
Yeah.
That new modes of experimentation are inevitable and desirable. It's just it's the question of how that will take shape. And
Yes.
And this is kind of why I like that you always cite the, from Anti-Oedipus, the notion of, what was it, Mr. Worker, Mother Earth. Was it Mother Earth, Mr. Worker, and their child, the little worker?
No. It's Father Capital, Mother Earth, and their child, the worker.
Okay, got yeah, I mixed that up. Yes, Father Capital. Yes, there you go. That's the affiliate of capital. I should have known
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, part of that is a quote directly from Marx, the father and the mother, and they add the child as the worker.
That's right.
To get at the Oedipus complex.
Yeah.
But there are at least two ways to think about this. One is that the nuclear family is already being chipped away at, among other things, by multi-generational residences now.
Mm-hmm.
Where children can't find jobs and support themselves.
Right.
And grandparents need either provide support or need support themselves. So that's sort of on the desperation end of things. But on the positive end of things, and this is more along the lines of what I was thinking in Nomad Citizenship, is that if you're going to go, I don't know if I mentioned this in the book, but there are babysitting co-ops.
Yes, you did.
I did. Okay, so we belong to one, and you don't really have money. You just trade hours, and it works fine. And so that's a form of cooperative reproduction.
Yeah.
That if it were taken just a few degrees farther, would begin to seriously chip away at the self-containment of the nuclear family. There are movements in Europe now about building residents that hold 5 families instead of 1.
Yeah.
There's hints here and there about how it might look, but it's a tough nut to crack, and I didn't go very far in trying to address that.
That's an idea for your next work, but you had already kind of, if you think of the Perversions of the Market as a sequel to Nomad Citizenship, I think that you would have retread the same ground in a certain way. It is a theme that you were consistent upon even as early as the introduction to schizoanalysis, is that, one of their targets is this artificial shoring up of the nuclear family, and how that already plays in to having this anchor for the reproduction of, capitalist relations.
Yeah. And one of the things that I don't think I pointed out, or maybe not strenuously enough, is that Freud himself is at his worst when he's talking about reproduction. Because he presumes that the entire organism should be focused on reproducing the species.
Yeah.
And that really puts a noxious spin on perversity, because perversity is the positive side of perversity is that it's delinked from the necessity of the organism or the species surviving.
Right.
And the body without organs is a very poetic way of trying to capture some of that.
Yeah.
Of that move away from always propping pleasure on need.
Yes.
Which is the key thing in Freud and in Lacan maybe less in Lacan, but still that they object to in Freud, certainly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's why you kind of mentioned briefly, that's one of the benefits to someone like Laplanche, who goes back to these terms that are not as, they're almost semi-concepts in Freud. They're there, but they're doing a lot of work, but he's not thematizing them, which is like the notion of propping, which is like the notion of Nachträglichkeit, the after the event is
Right.
one way of putting it.
Yeah.
And coming back and thematizing them a little bit more in order to kind of, well, I like Laplanche because of his way of generalizing seduction and showing that to be part of psychogenesis. But I know we're getting far afield. Just alternatives to Freud, and especially the what I think that one of the big takeaways that I guess I take it from Deleuze and Guattari, but I think that you made very clear to me is the fact that, as you said, always historicize. It's the historicizing of the unconscious, of social relations, that really puts pressure on some of these, especially these later Freud concepts, like the Oedipus complex.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Even if you historicize non-linearly, which is what they do in Thousand Plateaus.
Yes.
It gets tricky, but yeah.
Any parting thoughts, Cooper, or we can wind down? I mean, I feel like we've got an excellent. We've had an excellent discussion, and
absolutely. I think I'm sort of expended I've expended as much as I can
Okay.
today, but I mean, there's so much that we could talk to Eugene about. So I just want to say I really enjoyed reading. I didn't get to read as much as Taylor, but I did read the Intro to Schizoanalysis and the S&M work as well.
S&M work.
Yeah, sorry.
No, that's all right. I've had to steer clear of that. And people say, "Oh, you're researching S&M, huh?
Oh,
how's
gosh.
it going?"
Yeah.
Perversion of the market. I can. Perversion of the market.
Thank you. Yes,
but
right.
just immensely helpful in my understanding of anti-Oedipus, and just has had me, I don't know, intellectually excited and stimulated all week. And just thinking about the impact, I think, in particularly like the way that you were discussing the Kantian, I guess, ethics as it pertains to both capitalism and the family. I mean, that just really snapped for me. And then you kind of touch on that a bit as well in the Perversion in the marketplace as well. I recognize some resonances.
Yes, that's right. Something about Kantian schema comes up. Yeah. Nietzsche was such a Nietzsche and Deleuze both had such a love-hate relationship with Kant. It's really quite remarkable to see how they negotiate that.
And it sounds like that you need to get that. You have another caller. You have another podcast to go on.
Okay.
Eugene,
Well, this has been great fun, guys. I really appreciate the invitation. I've had a great time, and if you want, we can do it again.
Oh, we'd love that.
We'd
love to have
absolutely.
you back later in the year, and hopefully by that time you'll be working on a new book that we can talk about.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Eugene.
Thanks,
we appreciate you.
Okay. Bye, guys.
Cheers. Bye. And that will wrap up this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins. Once again, thanks to Eugene Holland for being such an amazing guest. We'll see y'all next week.
The very roots of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.